Okay, here we go, reading 58, Doing Anti-Racism Towards an Egalitarian Society. I normally provide you a lot of info, not a lot, or at least a little bit of a background on the author of a reading, but this one has several authors, so let's just say that they're all sociologists. And here we go back to an academic approach, as the authors state, rightly so, that how an end to racism and discrimination has been approached thus far has not worked. As indicated in previous readings, the whole colorblind approach and teaching tolerance approach are fallible for several reasons. On the surface, they appear to create equality, but they don't because they don't require people to acknowledge their own privilege and their own unbalanced power that results from that privilege. So it's not possible to be separate but equal. People might think it is, people might think there's nothing wrong with it, but there is. And this is why what happens is that, as indicated, a person can feel good about themselves. They say, I'm a very liberal person. But at the same time, they continue to benefit from their own privilege and don't recognize that. But eliminating racism and discrimination is not just a matter of where do we go from here. It is also a matter of what do we do about what occurred and what was built in the past. You cannot ignore past oppression, which is something many people who were not systematically oppressed thinks we as a society should do. Just as racism has been systematically, step by step, built into our society, it must be removed systematically, step by step, socially, economically, politically, religiously. But I have to wonder if that's truly possible, not to be a pessimist. The reading makes the point that in the United States, the Constitution was created by white men, upper class white men, and only them, who probably never considered for a moment that at some point in the future the country would be any different. Specifically, they probably never considered the possibility that people of other races would have, at least in theory, the exact same rights as they did, or that women would, or that somebody of a lower economic status should. So, if that document is the basis of the modern country, is it possible to then restructure and reform it to be all inclusive when it did not take all citizens into account? If you build a house and then as the years go by, you add on another floor and another floor and another floor, will the foundation of that house still be suitable to support the house as a whole? Is this the origin of the reason why women in the US are so underrepresented in political office as well as Native Americans? So that is kind of two issues in one, having no representation when the founding principles of the country were established, and having no ability to interpret it then in their own way. In addition, in the United States, it's very common for their Constitution to still be presented and considered as is, in its original form, with its original intent, an originalist framework as described in the reading. Even though it's a few hundred years old, and a little about the country itself, the structure of society, resembles the way the country was when the Constitution was originally written. And maybe it's just me, but this does seem to be more common in the US than in most other countries. So, not that other countries ignore the significance of their historical beginnings, but in the US, the significance of historical beginnings, such as the Constitution, is perceived to take on much more significance. The whole debate about gun control is a really good example of this. As the Second Amendment in the Constitution says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This is the most common argument put forth by gun advocates. Anytime there's the suggestion that the need for individuals to be armed has gone too far, that there should be a certain ban on certain kind of rifles, anything. Their argument is that to do so would infringe upon people's fundamental rights as outlined in the Constitution. The Constitution that was written a few hundred years ago, again, based on a kind of society that no longer exists. It was written a few hundred years ago by elite white men who determined for everybody else what was right or wrong. but many continued to insist on taking it at face value, as written, literally following every single word. In other words, the original interpretation of the Second Amendment is still considered the only interpretation, and that is it, known as stare decisis. And there's another issue here. Sure, theoretically, it's possible to change the Constitution, to propose an amendment to it. There is a process through which this is possible. But, and this is a huge, ginormous but, to do so requires a successful vote by people who would most often not benefit from these amendments. The vast majority of those people whose support is needed to pass an amendment to the Constitution, upper-class white men, do not need any amendments themselves. And since they would not benefit, the motivation to see any amendment through is simply not there in the same way it would be for people who would benefit. So we've got four main problems here encountered when trying to ensure that truly all people, regardless of race or gender, will be viewed as equal. They had absolutely no representation when the Constitution was originally drafted. They have no control in how it was interpreted then. They have no control on how it is interpreted now. And having amendments passed is so difficult, it's almost impossible to accomplish. So what the reading does is try to imagine what would it be like to create a totally, truly egalitarian society? What would this society look like and what it would be based on? Both in terms of founding documents and in terms of the structure of society itself. Well, this would necessitate a specific focus on a different approach to and structure of politics, education, religion, individual responsibility. And not just a shift, not just starting what's already there and modifying it, a totally different approach. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is offered as a good starting point. A constitution that is truly democratic and that encompasses recognition of all citizens, acknowledging and trying to make amends for the mistakes of the past, focusing on democracy and inclusivity of all people within that democratic system. And I've actually included a copy of this on Blackboard if you want to see what it actually says. This is possible, to acknowledge and try to make amends for mistakes of the past, and there has already been a precedent set for that occurring, albeit a small one compared to Black Americans and Native Americans. In World War II, after Pearl Harbor was bombed in Hawaii in December 41, President Roosevelt ordered all Japanese Americans forcefully relocated and incarcerated in internment camps in the interior, most of whom had been living on the western coast of the U.S. An executive order was passed, Executive Presidential Order 9066, and this authorized the Secretary of War to designate certain areas of the U.S. as military zones. And that meant it was possible to clear the way for the incarceration of Japanese Americans. People who were as little as 1/16 Japanese could be relocated. And in addition, all of their property was confiscated. They were only allowed to take what they could carry, so they lost the contents of their homes and their homes themselves, businesses, vehicles, everything. And when the war was over, they had to completely start over. It isn't like any of this was given back to them. So in 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act to compensate more than 100,000 people of Japanese descent who were incarcerated in internment camps during World War II. This legislation offered a formal apology and paid out $20,000 in compensation to each surviving victim. But the law only won congressional approval after a 10-year-long campaign by the Japanese American community. And let's be honest, the $20,000 per each surviving victim really is a drop in the bucket compared to what each lost, saying nothing of all those older people who died before this occurred. But this does demonstrate that it is possible for a government to admit wrongdoing and try to make up for it in some way, specifically the American government. So this could happen for Black Americans and for Native Americans. Creating a truly equal and just society necessitates explicit attention regarding education as well in more than one way. Absolutely, equal education should mean just that, with equally funded schools, regardless of where they're located, who is attending, the socioeconomic status of the student's parents. A quality education should not be linked to wealth. And if this happened, it would cause a domino effect regarding teacher qualifications, resources, etc. And I think when somebody talks about quality in education, these issues are exactly what comes to mind. But in a truly equal education system, these would be just one part of the formula. There would also need to be representation of all people at all levels of the system. So an equal representation, not just a token Black or a token woman or a token Native American, you'd need them at the highest decision-making levels. Racism is systemic. So eliminating racism needs to address the system, to change the system at its core. And in addition, as part of this, the system is created and run by individual people. So it's not just a systemic problem, it's also an individual problem. And this is part of the rationale for needing representation of people, of all people at all levels of the system. And as your reading indicates, there is absolutely nothing natural about division, about separating people in any way. So when it occurs, ostensibly because of differences in wealth, for example, that's still not natural. Oh, well, you attend your school because I have the money to pay for it, and Jennifer attends her school because that's what her parents can afford. But what this does is teach the next generation that separation is okay and inevitable, that it's excusable when it's not. This just reinforces racial stereotypes and makes people comfortable with the idea of separation. And for all its good intentions, religion is not exempt from the need to change. It's no longer used in mainstream society as a justification for racism or as the basis of widespread subjugation of somebody based on race. But at the same time, it is problematic and it's still used to declare certain people as less than based on other qualities. It's common for people to declare that somebody should be ostracized based on religious reasoning in relation to their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And yet, some do continue to do so based on a person's race. Is it possible to dispense with, or at least lessen, the influence of religion as we know it now, and instead have the majority of society embrace a more common and mutually supportive human spirituality? I don't know. Of course, it sounds wonderful. The point being made is that much like in the previous reading, and much like in this reading, where it's pointed out that the US is ideologically founded on the Constitution, even though the Constitution was created by an extremely small minority of elite society and did not include representation of all, religion, as it has been structured and practiced and implemented, has been the same. And this reading makes a good point that churches in the US continue to be one of the most racially segregated places in the country, as well as elsewhere. Yet, when you come right down to it, all major religions really have a lot in common in terms of their basic principles. So with that in mind, maybe the idea of a common human spirituality is not as far out as it sounds. And the reading makes another point that really comes back to the previous one about being an ally to people of color, and that is the need to do racism. What this means is not just being theoretically or ideologically opposed to racism, but again, being active in trying to help stop racism from occurring, whether an act or racist thought. Yes, get out of your comfort zone. Get out of your rut and the extremely common reaction of being momentarily distressed and then maybe sharing a social media post, and then you go on to something else. This is something else for which a precedent has already been set. When, during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, some white Americans actively participated in the effort to register Black Americans to vote. Some white Americans accompanied Black Americans in the freedom rides on buses, traveling state to state in an effort to desegregate them. They worked together, not just focused on individualistic examples of racism. They focused on changing the system itself in various ways. But just how far is somebody willing to go? For example, it's pretty common to hear somebody say in general conversation, I am completely 100% in favor of equal rights. How people of color were treated in the past is shameful and was wrong. No two ways about it. But I have a huge problem with affirmative action. If you want people to be equal, being equal doesn't mean that one group has an advantage over another, and that is what affirmative action does. So I realize this cartoon is not in reaction to race, but the principle still stands. On the surface, just the surface, they are right. But as soon as you go just slightly below the surface, the fact is that affirmative action, positive steps taken to increase the representation of women and minorities in areas of employment, education, and culture, from which they have been historically excluded, is in place not to give minorities an advantage. They are implemented to bring minorities up to an equal position. And this is because of what has occurred historically speaking, meaning that currently they are not in an equal position. So a person may be totally pro equal rights, totally gung-ho, until their own power is threatened, and they need to understand that is what's occurring. In order for white society to be truly racist free, it will require, as indicated in the reading, people not of color to first of all be sympathetic. You all know what it means to feel sympathy for somebody, but this is more than just feeling sorry for somebody because they've been the subject to other racist individuals or a racist system. It also means taking a genuine interest in the issues faced by people of color. Empathy is necessary. It's necessary for people to truly see and feel the pain of somebody being subjected to racism, which means more than watching a video on YouTube or a news report. It means truly empathizing. And as part of that, recognizing and accepting that your own position of privilege has done something to contribute to a racist system. And a racist-free society also requires what the authors call transformative insight, something that will most likely occur in an interracial relationship, because being part of such a relationship would allow you to have the insight to realize how racialized society is, and thus transform your perception. Most importantly, in regards to how simply being white grants a person privilege. This is not a quick process, and it will develop over time through a progressive understanding. So, is it possible to create a society or to modify ours to result in one that is truly free in racism and discrimination? Yes, never say never. It would require openly acknowledging, without any qualifications, the mistakes of the past, which has not yet happened. It would require restructuring the very basis of society in pretty much every way, as it is not possible to have a racist-free society if the foundation of it was created and implemented with racist ideologies by racist people. It would require white society truly, freely giving up the privilege they have always enjoyed and not just giving it lip service. And all of this is possible. Possible being the key word. Not inevitable, not even likely, without extremely serious, all-encompassing changes that need to occur first. And frankly, for myself, for example, when I think of opposition to affirmative action policies, and maybe even the natural human tendency to enjoy being in a rut and keeping things the same as they've always been, because there is a certain degree of comfort in that. I am not sure I'm optimistic that something like this could ever occur, but it is possible, and that is the point of the reading.